Chapter 5, Part 1 of Agriculture for Beginners. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diana Schmidt. Agriculture for Beginners by Charles William Burkett. Chapter 5, Part 1 Horticulture. Section 25, Market Gardening. The word horticulture is one of those broad words under which much is grouped. It includes the cultivation of orchard fruits, such as apples and plums, of small fruits, such as strawberries and raspberries, of garden vegetables for the table, of flowers of all sorts, including shrubbery and ornamental trees, and their arrangement into beautiful landscape effects around our homes. Horticulture, then, is a name for an art that is both far-reaching and important. The word gardening is generally given to that part of horticulture which has for its chief aim the raising of vegetables for our tables. Flower gardening, or the cultivation of plants valued for their bloom in making ornamental beds and borders and furnishing flowers for the decoration of the home, is generally called floriculture. Landscape gardening is the art of so arranging flower beds, grass, shrubbery, and trees as to produce pleasing effects in the grounds surrounding our homes and in great public parks and pleasure grounds. Landscape gardening, like architecture, has developed into as the artist makes them on canvas, but uses natural objects in his pictures instead of print and canvas. Market gardening. Formerly, market gardening was done on small tracts of land in the immediate vicinity of large cities, where supplies of stable manure could be used from the city stables. But with the great increase in the population of the cities, these small areas could no longer supply the demand, and the introduction of commercial fertilizers and the building of railroads enabled gardeners at great distances from city markets to grow and ship their products. Hence, the markets, even in winter, are now supplied with fresh vegetables from regions where there is no frost. Then, as spring opens, fruits and vegetables are shipped from more temperate regions. Later, vegetables and fruits come from the sections nearer the great cities. This gradual nearing of the supply fields continues until the gardens near the cities can furnish what is needed. The market gardeners around the great northern cities, finding that winter products were coming from the south and from warmer regions, began to build hothouses, and by means of steam and hot water pipes to make warm climates in these glass houses. Many acres of land in the colder sections of the country are covered with heated glass houses, and in them during the winter are produced fine crops of tomatoes, lettuce, radishes, cauliflowers, eggplants, and other vegetables. The degree of perfection which these attain, in spite of having such artificial culture, and their freshness as compared to the products brought from a great distance, have made winter gardening under glass a very profitable business. But it is a business that calls for the highest skill and the closest attention. No garden, even for home use, is complete without some glass sashes, and the garden will be all the more successful if there is a small heated greenhouse for starting plants that are afterwards to be set in the garden. Hotbeds. If there is no greenhouse, a hotbed is an important help in the garden. The bed is made by digging a pit 2 feet deep, 7 feet wide, and as long as necessary. The material for the hotbed is fresh horse manure mixed with leaves. This is thrown into a heap to heat. As soon as steam is seen coming from the heap, the manure is turned over and piled again, so that the outer part is thrown inside. When the whole is uniformly heated and has been turned 2 or 3 times, it is packed firmly into the pit already dug. A frame 6 feet wide, 12 inches high on the north side, and 8 inches on the south side, and as long as the bed is to be, is now made of plank. This is set upon the heated manure, thus leaving 6 inches on each side outside the frame. More manure is then banked all around it, and 3 or 4 inches of fine, light, and rich soil are placed inside the frame. The frame is then covered with hotbed sashes 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. These slide up and down on strips of wood let into the sides of the frame. A thermometer is stuck into the soil and closely watched, for there will be too much heat at first for sowing seed. When the heat in the early morning is about 85 degrees, seeds may be sowed. The hotbed is used for starting tomato plants, eggplants, cabbage plants, and other vegetables that cannot stand exposure. It should be made about 8 or 10 weeks before the tender plants can be set out in the locality. In the south and southwest, it should be started earlier than in the north. For growing the best tomato plants, and for such hardy plants as lettuce and cabbage, it will be better to have cold frames in addition to the hotbed. These need not be more than 2 or 3 sashes. Cold frames. A cold frame is like the frame used for a hotbed, but it is placed on a well-manured soil in a sheltered spot. It is covered with the same kind of sashes, and is used for hardening the plants sowed in the hotbed. The frame must be well banked with earth on the outside, and the glass must be covered on cold nights with straw, mats, or old carpets to keep out frost. Care of hotbed and cold frame. If the sun be allowed to shine brightly on the glass of a cold frame or hotbed, it will soon raise the temperature in the hotbed to a point that will destroy the plants. It is necessary, then, to pay close attention to the bed, and, when the sun shines, to slip the sashes down or raise them and place a block under the upper end to allow the steam to pass off. The cold frame must also be aired when the sun shines, and the sashes must be gradually slipped down in mild weather. Finally, they may be removed entirely on sunshiny days, so as to accustom the plants to the open air, but they must be replaced at night. For a while, before setting the plants in the open gardens, leave the sashes off night and day. While the hotbed may be used for starting plants, it is much better and more convenient to have a little greenhouse with fire heat for this purpose. A little house with but 4 sashes on each side will be enough to start a great many plants, and will also give room for some flowers in pots. With such a house a student can learn to manage a more extensive structure if he gives close attention to airing, watering, and keeping out insects. Sowing. The time for sowing the different kinds of seeds is an important matter. Seeds vary greatly in their requirements. All need 3 conditions: a proper degree of heat, moisture, and air. Some seeds, like English peas, parsnips, beets, and radishes, will germinate and grow when the soil is still cool in the early spring, and peas will stand quite a frost after they are up. Therefore plant English peas as early as the ground can be worked. But if we should plant seeds like corn, string or snap beans, squashes, and other tender plants before the ground is warm enough, they would decay. Seeds cannot germinate in soil that is perfectly dry, for there must be moisture to swell them and start growth. The oxygen of the air is also necessary, and if seeds are buried so deeply that the air cannot reach them, they will not grow, even if they are warm and moist. The depth of planting must vary with the character and size of the seed. English peas may be covered 6 inches deep and will be all the better for such covering, but if corn be covered so deep, it hardly gets above the ground. In planting small seeds like those of the radish, cabbage, turnip, lettuce, etc., a good rule is to cover them 3 times the thickness of the seed. In sowing seeds, when the ground is rather dry, it is a good plan, after covering them, to tramp on the row so as not to press the soil closely to the seeds and to help it to retain moisture for germination, but do not pack the soil if it is damp. In spring, never dig or plow the garden while it is still wet, but always wait until the soil is dry enough to crumble freely. What crops to grow? The crops to be raised will of course depend on each gardener's climate, surroundings, and markets. Sometimes it may pay a grower, if his soil and climate are particularly suited to one crop, to expend most of his time and energy on this crop. For example, in some sections of New York, on potatoes; in parts of Michigan, on celery; in Georgia, on watermelons; in western North Carolina, on cabbage. If circumstances allow this sort of gardening, it has many advantages, for of course it is much easier to acquire skill in growing one crop than in growing many. On the other hand, it often happens that a gardener's situation requires him to grow most of the crops known to gardening. Each gardener then must be guided in his selection of crops by his surroundings. Care of crops. The gardener who wishes to attain the greatest success in his art must do 4 things. First, he must make his land rich and keep it rich. Much of his success depends on getting his crops on the market ahead of other growers. To do this, his crops must grow rapidly, and crops grow rapidly only in rich soil. Then, too, land conveniently situated for market gardening is nearly always costly. Hence, the successful market gardener must plan to secure the largest possible yield from as small an area as practicable. The largest yield can of course be secured from the richest land. Second, the gardener must cultivate his rich land most carefully and economically. He crowds his land with products that must grow apace. Therefore he, least of all growers, can afford to have any of his soil go to feed weeds, to have his land wash, or to have his growing crops suffer for lack of timely and wise cultivation. To cultivate his land economically, the gardener must use the best tools and machines and the best methods of soil management. Third, to get the best results, he must grow perfect vegetables. To do this, he must add to good tillage a knowledge of the common plant diseases and of the ways of insects and bacterial pests. He must know how and when to spray, how and when to treat his seed, how and when to poison, how and when to trap his insect foes and to destroy their hiding places. Fourth, not only must the gardener grow perfect vegetables, but he must put them on the market in perfect condition and in attractive shape. Who cares to buy wilted, bruised, spoiling vegetables? Gathering, bundling, crating, and shipping are all to be watched carefully. Baskets should be neat and attractive, crates clean and snug, barrels well packed and well headed. Careful attention to all these details brings a rich return. Among the gardener's important crops are the following. Asparagus. This is a hardy plant. Its seed may be sowed either early in the spring or late in the fall. The seeds should be planted in rows. If the plants are well cultivated during the spring and summer, they will make vigorous roots for transplanting in the autumn. In the fall, prepare a piece of land by breaking it unusually deep and by manuring it heavily. After the land is thoroughly prepared, make it in furrows for the asparagus roots. These furrows should be 6 inches deep and 3 feet apart. Then remove the roots from the rows in which they have been growing during the summer, and set them 2 feet apart in the prepared furrows. Cover carefully at once. In the following spring, the young shoots will be well cultivated. In order to economize space, beets or lettuce may be grown between the asparagus rows during the first season. With the coming of cold weather, the asparagus must again be freely manured and all dead tops cut off. Some plants will be ready for market the second spring. If the bed is kept free from weeds and well manured, it will increase in productiveness from year to year. Beans. The most generally planted beans are those known as string or snap beans. Of the many varieties, all are sensitive to cold, and hence must not be planted until frost is over. Another widely grown kind of bean is the lima, or butter bean. There are 2 varieties of the lima bean. One is large and generally grows on poles. This kind does best in the northern states. The other is a small bean and may be grown without poles. This kind is best suited to the warmer climates of the southern states. Cabbage. In comparatively warm climates, the first crop of cabbage is generally grown in the following way. The seeds are sowed in beds in September, and the plants grown from this sowing are in November transplanted to ground laid off in sharp ridges. The young plants are set on the south side of the ridges in order that they may be somewhat protected from the cold of winter. As spring comes on, the ridge is partly cut down at each working until the field is leveled, and thereafter the cultivation should be level. Early cabbage needs heavy applications of manure. In the spring, nitrate of soda applied in the rows is very helpful. Seeds for the crop following this early crop should be sowed in March. Of course, these seeds should be of a later variety than the first used. The young plants should be transplanted as soon as they are large enough. Early cabbages are set in rows 3 feet apart, the plants 18 inches apart in the row. As the later varieties grow larger than the earlier ones, the plants should be set 2 feet apart in the row. In growing late fall and winter cabbage, the time of sowing varies with the climate. For the northern and middle states, seeding should be done during the last of March and in April. South of a line passing west from Virginia, it is hard to carry cabbages through the heat of summer and get them to head in the fall. However, if the seeds are sowed about the 1st of August in rich and moist soil, and the plants set in the same sort of soil in September, large heads can be secured for the December market. Celery. In the extreme northern part of our country, celery seeds are often sowed in a greenhouse or hotbed. This is done in order to secure plants early enough for summer blanching. This plan, however, suits only very cool climates. In the middle states, the seeds are usually sowed in a well-prepared bed about April. The young plants are moved to other beds as soon as they need room. Generally, they are transplanted in July to rows prepared for them. These should be 4 feet apart, and the plants should be set 6 inches apart in the row. The celery bed should be carefully cultivated during the summer. In the fall, hill the stalks up high enough to keep them erect. After the growing season is over, dig them and set them in trenches. The trenches should be as deep as the celery is tall. After the celery is put in them, they should be covered with boards and straw. In the more southern states, celery is usually grown in beds. The beds are generally made 6 feet wide, and rows a foot apart are run crosswise. The plants are set 6 inches apart in September, and the whole bed is earthed up as the season advances. Finally, when winter comes, the beds are covered with leaves or straw to prevent the plants from freezing. The celery is dug and bunched for market at any time during the winter. By means of cold frames, a profitable crop of spring celery may be raised. Have the plants ready to go into the cold frames late in October or early in November. The soil in the frame should be made very deep. The plants should make only a moderately rapid growth during the winter. In the early spring they will grow rapidly and so crowd one another as to blanch well. As celery grown in this way comes on the market, at a time when no other celery can be had, it commands a good price. In climates as warm as that of Florida, beds of celery can be raised in this way without the protection of cold frames. A slight freeze does not hurt celery, but a long continued freezing spell will destroy it. Some kinds of celery seem to turn white naturally. These are called self-blanching kinds. Other kinds need to be banked with the earth in order to make the stalks whiten. This kind usually gives the best and crispest stalks. Cucumbers and cantaloupes. Although cucumbers and cantaloupes are very different plants, they are grown in precisely the same way. Some gardeners plant them in hills. However, this is perhaps not the best plan. It is better to lay the land off in furrows 6 feet apart. After filling these with well-rotted stable manure, throw soil over them. Then make the top flat and plant the seeds. After the plants are up, thin them out, leaving them a foot or more apart in the rows. Cultivate regularly and carefully until the vines cover the entire ground. It is a good plan to sow cowpeas at the last working of cantaloupes in order to furnish some shade for the melons. As both cucumbers and cantaloupes are easily hurt by cold, they should not be planted until the soil is warm and all danger of frost is past. Cucumbers are always cut while they are green. They should never be pulled from the vine, but should always be cut with a piece of the stem attached. Cantaloupes should be gathered before they turn yellow and should ripen in the house. In some sections of the country, the little striped cucumber beetle attacks the melons and cucumbers as soon as they come up. These beetles are very active, and if their attacks are not prevented, they will destroy the tender plants. Bone dust and tobacco dust applied just as the plants appear above the ground will prevent these attacks. This treatment not only keeps off the beetle, but also helps the growth of the plants. Eggplants. Eggplants are so tender that they cannot be transplanted like tomatoes to cold frames and gradually hardened to stand the cold spring air. These plants, started in a warm place, must be kept there until the soil to which they are to be transplanted is well warmed by the advance of spring. After the warm weather has fully set in, transplant them to rich soil, setting them 3 feet apart each way. This plant needs much manure. If large, perfect fruit is expected, the ground can hardly be made too rich. Eggplants are subject to the same bacterial blight that is so destructive to tomatoes. The only way to prevent this disease is to plant in ground not lately used for tomatoes or potatoes. Onions. The method of growing onions varies with the use to which it is intended to put them. To make the early sorts, which are eaten green in the spring, little onions called sets are planted. These are grown from seeds sowed late in the spring. The seeds are sowed thickly in rows in rather poor land. The object of selecting poor land is that the growth of the sets may be slow. When the sets have reached the size of small marbles, they are ready for fall planting. In the South, the sets may be planted in September. Plant them in rows in rich and well-fertilized soil. They will be ready for market in March or April. In the more northerly states, the sets are to be planted as early as possible in the spring. To grow ripe onions, the seeds must be sowed as early in the spring as the ground can be worked. The plants are thinned to a stand of 3 inches in the rows. As they grow, the soil is drawn away from them so that the onion sits on top of the soil with only their roots in the earth. As soon as the tops ripen, pull the onions and let them lie in the sun until the tops are dry. Then put them under shelter, as onions keep best with their tops attached. Do not remove these until it is time for marketing. Peas. The English pea is about the first vegetable of the season to be planted. It may be planted as soon as the ground is in workable condition. Peas are planted in rows, and it is a good plan to stretch wire netting for them to climb on. However, where peas are extensively cultivated, they are allowed to fall on the ground. There are many sorts of peas, differing both in quality and in time of production. First to be planted are the extra early varieties. These are not so fine as the later, wrinkled sorts, but the seeds are less apt to rot in cold ground. Following these, some of the fine, wrinkled sorts are to be planted in regular succession. Peas do not need much manure and do best in a light, warm soil. Tomatoes. There is no vegetable grown that is more widely used than the tomato. Whether fresh or canned, it is a staple article of food that can be served in many ways. By careful selection and breeding, the fruit of the tomato has in recent years been much improved. There are now many varieties that produce perfectly smooth and solid fruit, and the grower can hardly go amiss in his selection of seeds if he bears his climate and his particular needs in mind. Early tomatoes are started in the greenhouse or in the hotbed about 10 weeks before the time for setting the plants in the open ground. They are transplanted to cold frames as soon as they are large enough to handle. This is done to harden the plants and to give them room to grow strong before the final transplanting. In kitchen gardens, tomatoes are planted in rows 4 feet apart with the plants 2 feet apart in the rows. They are generally trained to stakes with but 1 stalk to a stake. When there is plenty of space, however, the plants are allowed to grow at will and to tumble on the ground. In this way, they bear large crops. During the winter, the markets are supplied with tomatoes either from tropical sections or from hothouses. As those grown in the hothouses are superior in flavor to those shipped from Florida and from the West Indies, and as they command good prices, great quantities are grown in this way. In the South, the bacterial blight which attacks the plants of this family is a serious drawback to tomato culture. The only way to escape this disease is to avoid planting tomatoes on land in which eggplants, tomatoes, or potatoes have been blighted. Lime spread around the plants seems to prevent the blight for one season on some soils. At the approach of frost in the fall, green tomatoes can easily be preserved by wrapping them in paper. Gather them carefully and wrap each separately. Pack them in boxes and store in a cellar that is close enough to prevent the freezing of the fruit. A few days before the tomatoes are wanted for the table, unpack as many as are needed, remove the paper, and allow them to ripen in a warm room. Tomatoes require a rich soil. Scattering a small quantity of nitrate of soda around their roots promotes rapid growth. Watermelons. As watermelons need more room than can usually be spared in a garden, they are commonly grown as a field crop. A very light, sandy soil suits watermelons best. They can be grown on very poor soil if a good supply of compost be placed in each hill. The land for the melons should be laid off in about 10-foot checks. That is, the furrows should cross one another at right angles about every 10 feet. A wide hole should be dug where the furrows cross, and into this composted manure should be put. The best manure for watermelons is a compost of stable manure and wood mold from the forest. Pile the manure and wood mold in alternate layers for some time before the planting season. During the winter, cut through the pile several times until the two are thoroughly mixed and finely pulverized. Be sure to keep the compost heap under shelter. Compost will lose in value if it is exposed to rains. At planting time, put 2 or 3 shovelfuls of this compost into each of the prepared holes, and over the top of the manure scatter a handful of any high-grade complete fertilizer. Then cover fertilizer and manure with soil, and plant the seeds in this soil. In cultivating, plow both ways of the checked rows and throw the earth toward the plants. Some growers pinch off the vines when they have grown about 3 feet long. This is done to make them branch more freely, but the pinching is not necessary. A serious disease, the watermelon wilt, is rapidly spreading through melon growing sections. This disease is caused by germs in the soil, and the germs are hard to kill. If the wilt should appear in your neighborhood, do not allow any stable manure to be used on your melon land, for the germs are easily scattered by means of stable manure. The germs also cling to the seeds of diseased melons, and these seeds bear the disease to other fields. If you treat melon seeds as you are directed on page 135 to treat oat seeds, the germs on the seeds will be destroyed. By crossing the watermelon on the citron melon, a watermelon that is resistant to wilt has recently been developed and successfully grown in soils in which wilt is present. The new melon, inferior in flavor at first, is being improved from season to season and bids fair to rival other melons in flavor. End of chapter 5, part 1.